can remember going to the commander and trying to like plead my case and just crying. And he said, well, the Air Force is not cut out for some people. And I just remember thinking in my head, like, wow, after all I've done these past 7 years, like, you tell me that I'm not cut out for this. I mean, I just won Airman of the Quarter. I helped with the Angel Tree. I did so many things. And it's like, well, it's just not cut out for you. And I just didn't believe that. I knew in my heart that what he was saying wasn't true. But at the same time, I had to accept my new reality.
Welcome to Your Story Doesn't End Here, the mental health podcast for military and veterans. I'm your host, Rachel, and my mission with this podcast is to be a voice for those who don't have a voice, bring awareness to mental health issues, and provide value and solutions to help make life more abundant.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming back for another episode this week. Today's guest is Delvina J. She is a U.S. Air Force veteran, mental health advocate, speaker, writer, and the creator of the Bipolar Black Girl podcast. Delvina was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, where she lived with her mother until joining the military. Through her experiences with early childhood trauma, watching her mother struggle with mental health challenges, and Delvina's own mental health diagnosis, she has made it her mission to shine a light on mental health amongst communities of color, especially for Black and Brown women. Delvina, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's a pleasure for me to be here.
So I'd love to just dive into your story, hear everything that you have to say, and just take it from there.
Okay, well, let's see. It's I don't really know where to begin, but I guess I'll just start somewhere. So my first experiences with mental health were through my mother. And so when I was younger, I knew that something wasn't okay with my mom. Like I knew she was like kind of sad, and I knew that she would go into the hospital sometimes and stay for like a couple weeks and then come back home and that kind of thing. But I didn't really grasp what was going on with her until probably I was about maybe 12 or 13. And I really realized like, okay, my mom is struggling with her mental health. And even then I still didn't know the extent to which she was struggling because no one ever talked about it, in my family. It was just like a quiet as kept hush hush kind of thing. And so that's how I experienced my mental health journey with her. And then when I was 18, my mother passed away. And after that, I was left having questions like, what exactly did she have? Or what was, like all these unanswered questions. And so I decided to, let me fast forward a little bit. I decided to join the military, join the Air Force. And while I was in the Air Force, I started struggling with my own mental health issues. At first, it was like diagnosed as an adjustment disorder. So it was like, oh, well, she just has a hard time adjusting to military life, even though I was still doing well at my job, knocking everything out the park, like winning awards, all kinds of stuff. But it was like my personal life, I was struggling. And so, yeah, I was in the Air Force and I was doing well. I was a F-16 aircraft mechanic, so I was a crew chief. And that in itself was a struggle because I was the only Black girl in my flight, in my unit. And I was surrounded by all these guys and I was like trying to find my voice, and trying to figure out the job of, okay, this is a new thing for me. Like being a mechanic, I had never been a mechanic before, but I scored really high on my ASVAB in the mechanical area. So they were like, oh, well, you should be a crew chief. And I was like, me being naive, I was like, oh, sure, I'll do it. But that job in itself also challenged my mental health because I had to be tough. I had to be one of the guys. I had to show no emotion. And so that was like me covering up how I was really feeling inside. And so, yeah, then I ended up getting out of that career field, mechanic, AFSC, and I went and retrained as a chaplain assistant. But when I retrained as a chaplain assistant, I went from active duty to reserves. And so that was a whole nother adjustment for me because I wasn't used to balancing civilian life and military life. It was just military 24/7. So I knew how to do that. I was good at that. But when I had to balance a civilian life and a military life, that's when the two kind of collided, and it was not a good space that I was in. I had started to struggle with my mental health even more. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I was placed on a medication that was prohibited from, it prevented me from like deploying and stuff like that. So I went to a med board. The med board said they evaluated me. They said I was still okay to do my job. But at the same time as I was going through the med board, I was gaining weight because of the medication that I was on. And so I was being PT tested, and I wasn't supposed to be PT tested. I didn't find out until afterwards that because I was on the med board, they weren't supposed to PT test me. I wasn't supposed to come in uniform. I wasn't supposed to do any of those things. And so I can remember going to the commander and trying to like plead my case and just crying. And he said, well, the Air Force is not cut out for some people. And I just remember thinking in my head, like, wow, after all I've done these past 7 years, like, you tell me that I'm not cut out for this. I mean, I just won Airman of the Quarter. I won, I helped with the Angel Tree. I did so many things. And it's like, well, it's just not cut out for you. And I just didn't believe that. I knew in my heart that what he was saying wasn't true. But at the same time, I had to accept my new reality. Like, okay, so that started my transition out of the military. So I transitioned out, and man, it was a battle for probably about 8 to 10 years of trying to get stable, get on the right meds, find the right therapist. So yeah, it was definitely a journey, and it still is a journey.
So did you, I guess in reflection now, did you recognize that you were experiencing symptoms of bipolar disorder back early on when you were diagnosed with an adjustment disorder?
I thought that I was more so depressed. That's what I thought I was. And so as time went on, I kind of noticed little things that I would do that were kind of like, okay, maybe that's not that I was doing anything necessarily out of the ordinary, but maybe I would spend a little bit too much money, or I would kind of do things that were like without thinking about them. And I was kind of like, okay, that's probably not, not okay, not logical. But I really honestly thought I was just depressed. And even now with my diagnosis, I am more on the depressed side of things. And so sometimes I still wonder, like, is it just depression and PTSD and anxiety and all that stuff? But so, yeah, so I saw some signs, but I was thinking it was more so depression.
So it's interesting that you talk about like impulse buying and these things that I think a lot of military members just kind of brush off as like a day-to-day thing or like a symptom of stress. And this is why I wish there was more education out there about symptoms, especially because I think so many things get misdiagnosed because when we're diagnosed with an adjustment disorder, we still have questions in our head, right? Like, am I depressed? Do I have ADHD? And different things can show up as different symptoms. I know ADHD symptoms can show up as similar to symptoms of trauma and PTSD. And, so it's interesting that you bring up that point of like impulse buying. I think a lot of people in the military do things very impulsively. And so it just kind of like leaves me with that question of, is it a stress thing? Is it a coping thing? Or are more members of the military struggling with mental illness than we think?
I think that there are more members struggling with mental health challenges than we think. I would say, I mean, I've been out of the military since 2015, and then I came off of reserve status in 2018. So I would say the culture is slowly beginning to change. So where the command wants you to be more open about your mental health. But I think there's still that stigma and that fear there. So I think there are a lot more people that are really struggling, but they're too afraid to say something because they'll be looked at as weak. Or, if they go to mental health, they'll be red flagged or, yeah. So I think there's still a lot of work to do and to be done in that area.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. So you said that 2015 is when you got out of active duty. How long did you serve for?
I served for 7 years.
7 years. Okay. So you were kind of in that time frame where things were making pretty dramatic shifts in the military, right?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say right up until I got out, it was still kind of not really talked about as much with mental health. But I think after that is when things kind of started to change. I know they came out with the total airman perspective, which was like mind, body, and I think it was mind, body, spirit, something like that, where they looked at you as the total person and not just another number doing the job. So they did start to transition into that. And I think now it's probably a little bit more or less stigmatized for people to come out and say they have these issues. I know some commanders and stuff have like spoken up and said, hey, if you're struggling with your mental health, you don't have to struggle alone. Make sure you go and talk to someone. And then, by me being a chaplain assistant, a lot of people would come to the chapel instead of going to mental health to get counseling because they didn't want that stigma of going to mental health. So the chapel or the chaplain was there as well to kind of like guide military members through that. So that's another important point.
So did you feel supported the time that you were active duty and the time that you were a reservist from the military side of things? And if not, did you find something outside of the military to really support you with your own personal mental health journey?
I felt supported while I was on active duty because my symptoms weren't that severe and I was able to function daily and do everything, cross all the T's, dot all the I's, do everything that was required of me. But when I switched to the reserve side and I was having a hard time managing both my professional and my civilian life together, I didn't really feel as supported as I would have liked to. I felt like my leadership, my supervision, as long as I was doing good and I was winning awards, they were there for me. But when I started to fail my PT test because I was gaining weight due to the medication, or that was my biggest hurdle really was the PT test because everything else I was passing with flying colors. But due to the medication and the weight gain and the med board, that's what kind of ended things for me. But I didn't feel as supported as I would have liked to have been, especially with finding out that I wasn't supposed to be PT tested and then they wouldn't take the scores back. It was kind of like a slap in the face, like, oh, we were wrong, but it doesn't matter type thing. You don't matter to us anymore.
Yeah, the body issues, it's something that comes up a lot on this podcast, especially when we're talking about women. And, medication aside, I personally think that the military body standards are very outdated just because of the type of person we have joining the military now. You can't necessarily do a weight chart and expect that to fly. But when we're talking about medication and women's health issues and, mental health issues, and especially when you're going through a med board, I think I see a lot of people when it comes to medical things. And I'm curious to see if this is your experience when it comes to med board and medical things. I don't know if it's a lack of information or what it is, but they don't really know how to treat the person on med board. And so they try to still uphold that individual to the regular military standards, everything across the board, watch standing, PT tests, all that stuff. And then don't really try to go out of their way to accommodate that individual. Was that your experience with being on med board status?
I would agree, more so because I was a reservist and I was a non-traditional reservist. So I only drilled. I could drill for maybe a month straight, and then you wouldn't see me for the whole year. So my time was done differently. I wasn't a traditional reservist, 2 weeks a year and 1 week in a month. That wasn't my deal. So I was stationed at an active duty base. And so, most of the people there were active duty. So they're thinking this is what we do 24/7. And I'm having to explain to them no, that my detachment is at Warner Robins. I'm a reservist. Like, this is, you know what I'm saying? Like, my life is not the military 24/7 anymore. And
Right.
so I feel like I wasn't, I just feel like I wasn't supported as I could have been.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about your life as a reservist, because I don't get a whole lot of reservists on here. I talk to a lot of active duty. I was never in the reserves, so I've heard it's a whole different world. Talk to us a little bit about what life looks like as a reservist. Are you still having to uphold every standard of the military when you're not drilling? Is it just like, the weekend warrior, you only have to uphold the standards of the military when you're on your drill weekend?
Mhm.
Obviously, I have an idea of what these answers are, but I would
Mhm.
love to just hear from you what life looks like as a reservist and what are some of these challenges as a whole that reservists are experiencing that you think need to be addressed.
Okay, well, to start off, the Air Force has two different types of reservists. You have your category A and your category B. Your category A is like your 2 weeks a year, 1 week in a month. They're constantly in contact with their unit. Then the category B, which is what I was, which was an individual mobilized augmentee. Like I said, I could do 30 days at one time or do 2 months at one time, and then you wouldn't see me again until the next year. Or if there was some type of paperwork that needed to be done, or if I, got called in for some reason or whatever. So I felt like, I felt the challenges that I experienced were the adjusting to civilian life and realizing like, oh, I was in school. So I was trying to manage school and classes. And then I was still expected to be on my P's and Q's when it came to work. And the active duty personnel treated me like I was active duty. And I'm like, I'm not active duty. I understand what you're saying. Like, I still sign the paper. I still have to fulfill my commitment. But you have to understand there's a balancing act going on here. And I don't think a lot of people who are active duty understand that side of being a reservist or a guardsman. That it's like, it's not just like when your command calls, your life stops and you just go run and do what they need you to do. No, I have life, I have work, I have school outside of this.
Yeah, I could completely understand where you're coming. Well, not understand, I guess would be the right word, but I can see where you're coming from there and how that would be extremely challenging. I don't think that the reservist challenges and struggles are talked about enough. So I appreciate that you brought that up. And I think that I would love to see that as more of a topic talked about. Because you're right, a lot of the focus is on active duty. When people think of the military, they oftentimes think of active duty, and then we just call the reservists the weekend warriors. But I know some reservists that deploy more than active duty people. So
Yeah.
there's obviously a whole different world there. And it's hard enough getting out from active duty and going to be a civilian. But I couldn't imagine still having to have like a half military mindset, but then a civilian mindset at the same time. So I could see where that would be a mental health struggle for someone. And
Mhm.
I wish that there was more resources available. And maybe there is now. I just don't know about them,
Mhm.
but it doesn't seem like there is. So I appreciate that you shared that part of your story with us. Talk to us a little bit about what you are doing as a mental health advocate now.
Well, now what I'm doing is I have a podcast. It's called the Bipolar Black Girl Podcast. And so similar to, what you do with your audience, I talk to predominantly women, some men, but predominantly women, about mental health and mental health challenges. I have a blog. My website is bipolirblackgirl.com. So I write for my blog, and then I also do the social media, like I'm on TikTok and Instagram, just pretty much spreading the message that like it's okay to have a mental illness. It's not the end of the world. You're not weird. You're not different. You're not abnormal. Like, you can live a normal life, or quote unquote, what I guess whatever normal is. That's up to the individual. But you can live a life that is full and that is beautiful and that has meaning and purpose.
I love that. Where can we find your podcast at?
I'm on anywhere you get your podcast, basically Apple, Spotify, iHeart, Google. So wherever you get your podcasts, we're there.
Perfect. I will make sure to link your podcast in the show notes for anyone who wants to check it out. I have to say, I love that you are highlighting mental health amongst Black and Brown communities, something that is constantly brought up. I think more recently in the last few years is that mental health is something that just isn't talked about. And you highlighted this at the beginning of your story, how it just kind of, it was very hush hush. I think that we're kind of moving away from that, but it's still very much stigmatized. So I appreciate the work that you do. And I appreciate you coming on and sharing a little bit about your story, your personal life, your life in the Air Force. And, would definitely love to continue this discussion and do even more work to change the culture and change the stigma. But thank you so much for being a guest on the show today, Delvina.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen in today. Each week, I'll be bringing you value in the mental health space and its direct impact on service members and veterans. If you feel you personally got value today from this episode, it would mean the world to me if you would leave a 5-star rating and review and share this to your audience. Until next time, remember, your story matters, your mental health matters, and your story doesn't end here.